Afternoon. Great. I can see numbers kind of trickling off now. So let's begin. So thank you very much for joining me today and for today's webinar on calculating your carbon footprint, how to collect carbon data and ensure data quality. Just to quickly introduce myself, I am Sam Walker. I am a sustainability consultant at Action Sustainability in the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and I also work on the sustainability tool as well and the carbon calculator. So I have a background in sustainability strategy, performance measurement and management, environmental management systems, and of course in carbon as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin today. There are going to be Mentis, so will probably be one coming up very, very soon. So if you could have your phone to hand or a browser that you can kind of quickly just swap to so you can complete the Menti, that would be really, really great. I will share all the slides after the call today. Please also share your feedback. I will put in a feedback link at the end. It would be great to hear your opinion on the content that's covered, if you think anything is missing. And then also there will be time at the end for any questions. So please do put them in the Q&A box and I will get round to them at the end of the webinar. In terms of what we'll be covering today, it's kind of split into three different sections. So the first is going to be going over some of the basics with carbon. So we'll take a short look at climate change, what a carbon footprint is, why it matters that we aim to reduce our carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, and looking at kind of that carbon footprint and how it connects to strategy. The second part will then begin to look at how you can begin measuring your carbon footprint with the support of the carbon calculator. So we'll take a look at what apportionment means, the different scopes, the data you'll need to collect and where you'll collect it from, and then also the data quality element as well. And then that third section that we'll look at is going to be what do you do after you worked out your carbon footprint? It's going to be looking at performance measurement, what you do to kind of come up with a baseline year, and then coming up with a carbon reduction plan so you can identify what your carbon hotspots are and kind of start reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. Right at the end, I'll also just spend a couple of minutes highlighting some of the resources that you can take away and have a look at so you can learn a little bit more about what we covered today. So I'd like to just start by getting everyone to head to menti.com. So if you could either point your phone at the screen, and if you point it at that QR code, it should take you directly to menti.com. Or if you type in menti.com into your browser and type in the code 334260006, it should take you to a Menti exercise. So I am just going to swap over to that now. Here we go. So again, this is the code here, 334260006. I can see a couple of people have arrived already, which is great. If I let me just, have we got chat? Yes, so I'm just going to put it in the chat box as well. So menti.com, and then the code is 334260006. So the code is in the chat box there. I can see a couple of people have joined. I'll just give it a couple more minutes, or a minute, sorry. Let's see if anyone else wants to join. Yeah, this is good. See a couple now. Perfect. Great. Okay, so thank you. If you're having any problems joining, just mention it in the chat and hopefully we can give you a hand to get onto the Menti. But I can see that a lot of people are there now. So we'll start with that first question, which is what role position are you working in within your organization? So this is really useful for me to kind of understand in terms of the resources that I'll highlight at the end. Why is it, that you're here and kind of what is your role? So if you just want to put in the Menti, let me know. Environmental champion, that is a great start. Love that. General manager, yes, environmental manager. Okay, manager. So a bit of a combo here between sustainability, environmental positions, and just general buyers. Okay, ESG coordinator, compliance manager. Okay, so we've got quite a wide range of people here today, which is really, really good. Business intelligence. It's always great as well to have people in who work kind of specifically in the environment, sustainability sector, or in roles with that, but also have people who are kind of coming into contact with it, not on a daily basis. And yeah, sustainability, really big one there. Comms and engagement. Oh, that's cool. Procurement specialist. Yeah, policy. So there's a fair bit about compliance here. Okay, really, really good to see such a variety of people. So thank you very much for completing that one. I'm going to go on to the next question now, which is what is your current understanding of measuring your carbon footprint? So, of course, today's session, it's mostly going to be looking at how you can go about doing that. So for me, just really good to know who we have in the room, what kind of level of knowledge, experience. So yeah, complete beginner to it, which is you heard very little to it. Basic understanding. So you may have heard about carbon footprints, what it is before, how you might start to go about measuring your carbon footprint, but you want to know a little bit more. I have a good understanding, so you could probably just about do it, but you might struggle at points, and I have a great understanding, which is you're fine. So really good balance here, I guess. Good to see. Yeah, I mean, this is an introductory webinar, so I will definitely be going over the basics with where you should start with measuring your carbon emissions and coming up with that carbon footprint. But there's also going to be touching on that bit, as I mentioned, kind of after you've done that, which I think is really good to know. If you're kind of leaning more towards this, I have a good understanding, I have a great understanding. We'll hopefully cover some of the content as well. And I think what's really important is that also it's not a case of just measuring your carbon footprint and it's there. It should be a cycle. And I'll show a diagram that I have in a little bit where it kind of shows that cycle and kind of the steps involved in each so that once you have calculated your carbon emissions, you can go ahead and feed into the next year that you do it. That's really good. Thank you very much for that one. And then just finally at this point, I've got what are your motivations for wanting to understand more? So why are you here? And again, I think this is so, so key. Also just to understand kind of the resources that you have available. Are you doing it for compliance a lot of the time? Yeah, reporting, tenders. Yeah, so clients are asking more and more just to improve understanding. So that's really, really good. It's a good place to be in because it is going to get asked more and more kind of for organizations to measure their carbon footprint. Sorry, I was just saying social value, really, really good one. Um, so yes, this is all really good stuff. ISO 14001. Yeah, great. We actually have our audit coming up in a couple of days, so wish us luck. Improving knowledge, opportunities, personal development, ensure compliance. Yes, this is all really, really key. I think from having done this exercise a couple of times before, this is bang on, really. We would kind of expect to see that compliance really high. We'd expect to see it tenders, so clients asking for it more and more, and also that reporting piece as well. It's good to see, though, that this improving knowledge, personal development, just wanting to understand it a little bit more for personal reasons, because as I say, I think it is going to become more and more important. And I think there will become a point where that you're asked to do it for compliance or you're asked to do it for clients. So getting a little bit ahead there with that one. That's really good. So thank you very much for answering that. I do have one more Menti question for a little bit later. So if you just want to keep the page up, but what I will do is I will just go back to my presentation and we will go back to this slide. Yeah, great. I hope you can all still see my screen there. Perfect. So yeah, thank you very much for filling that out. Really, really good to know. And as I say, with the resources that I can recommend at the end, I can kind of tailor that a little bit based on the groups of people that we have here. So if we just go straight back to the beginning, we look at carbon, why it's important that organizations begin measuring carbon footprints and reducing carbon emissions. Hopefully this isn't going to be news to you, but yes, over the last 10 to 15 years, we've been seeing a range of different adverse impacts arising as a result of climate change. So I've just got a couple of images that really capture that. So we've had forest fires that have been happening all over the world, really. In Europe, Australia, they've had terrible forest fires happening all of the time, really. Of course, peak in summer. We have flooding in the UK that's been happening due to high rainfall, due to storms that are happening on a more frequent basis and generally higher magnitude. And then there's also other kind of impacts that are associated as well. So we've got the rising temperatures in the ocean, which are causing coral bleaching. And all of this is really leading to a lot of disruption socially as well. So if we look at modern slavery and we look at forced labor happening in the supply chains of a lot of organizations, we've got climate refugees now as a result, a direct result of climate change. So with all of this, really we need to act now, and organizations are kind of at the forefront of that battle. They need to kind of begin measuring what their carbon footprint is. And with all of these kind of impacts, there is an awareness that's been reached by a lot of governments that we need to act, and they are implementing kind of legislation around reducing carbon emissions and setting targets, which we can see on this slide here. So really with, governments wanting to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, we have seen a lot that have set targets. In the UK, we have the target to be net zero by 2050. And just for clarification, net zero is referring to this kind of concept of achieving a balance between the carbon emitted into the atmosphere and the carbon removed from it. So theoretically, we're not pumping any greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And we can see that there are a lot of countries, this is just kind of the UK and Ireland, most of them have committed to 2050. Scotland there is 2045, which is really, really great to see. But I mean, there's other countries as well that are really aiming to hit net zero by 2050. And from that, what we've seen is a lot of legislation that's come out, a lot of roadmaps that have been developed to help reduce carbon emissions. I've got a couple of examples here, depending on the infrastructure or the transport or the kind of just build back greener. So construction again, industries, and kind of a roadmap to kind of guiding how we intend to reach net zero by those particular dates. So what does all this legislation mean for organizations? Well, it's become a responsibility, and it's becoming more of a responsibility for organizations to measure their carbon emissions and reduce these. And this is kind of the concept that we refer to as a carbon footprint. So we use the term carbon footprint to describe the total amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions that an organization, a project, a product, or an event is responsible for. Key to point out here is that although you'll hear carbon dioxide or CO2 most commonly referred to, and you'll hear that a lot, there are other greenhouse gases that are contributing to climate change. A lot of these are more potent than carbon. So we've got methane there, which you may have heard more and more about from the agricultural industry, livestock, but also from the destruction of wetlands, permafrost, peat bogs that are melting, being destroyed, that's releasing all this methane as well. When we talk about climate change, though, it is most often that we speak about carbon. And the reason for that is that carbon is really the most abundant in the atmosphere and generally lasts a lot longer than the other gases as well. As a result, though, of all these other gases in there, what we tend to do is use a ton of CO2 equivalent calculation, which basically includes all these other gases in there. And it's kind of a calculation has taken place to say, okay, well, we know that 1 unit of methane is the equivalent to several units of CO2. And what that does is it kind of allows us to come up with this common unit, which then makes communicating our carbon emissions and our impacts on climate change a lot easier, especially to stakeholders. So it's really, really vital that as organizations, we are starting to measure our carbon footprint, and we are talking about it. We're communicating it to our different stakeholders, management, investors, the community, all of this. Again, because more and more people and stakeholders are becoming interested in it and the efforts that are being made by organizations to reduce their impact. Of course, there's a number of reasons why we should be doing this. So again, linking back to that Menti compliance right up there, yes, and staying ahead of regulation, it's really, really key. And that's not necessarily legislation that's going to be directly related to your organization itself. What we're seeing is that much larger organizations are now being asked to report their supply chains, scope three, which is then going to be your organization. So you're being asked to report your carbon emissions, and then they'll be reporting this. You've also got the improving reputation aspect of it. So again, like I was saying, to the local community, there's a lot more interest, retaining attracting talent. It's really, really key these days. It used to be that it was just you send a CV somewhere and you'd have all these background checks done on you. Now you're going away and you're doing the research on the organization itself. What are they doing for social value, for sustainability? What are they doing to reduce their carbon emissions? So really, really key. And also, yes, winning new work with tenders, becoming a market leader, etc. So really, really important again to understand your motivations for why you want to begin doing this. I think more so when you're talking to people internally to get them on your side, you've got these arguments for why it needs to be done, why you're doing it. It can be really difficult though, and that's why we've put this webinar together really, because it can be a really time consuming thing to do from the perspective of needing to collect all the data that you need to be able to measure your carbon footprint, so the different activities, but also then for calculating itself. And that's where we kind of came up with the idea of the carbon calculator. We wanted to make it a lot more streamlined, a lot more simple. So you just know which activities are relevant to you. You collect the data for them, you put it all into the carbon calculator, and then it goes away and it does the calculation behind the scenes, and you get that carbon footprint, which you can then use to identify your hotspots and then go from there. So I just want to now go quickly back to Menti, and I've just got one more question there, which is asking about, let me go back, excuse me. Where are you with measuring your carbon emissions? So again, this probably relates a little bit to whether you're kind of right at the beginning there or you're a little bit further along. But I'll just read these out because it's quite small. But no intention to measure our carbon emissions at the beginning. We have the intention to start, so that's really beginner. Then the next one is we've identified which parts of our organization and activities are relevant, but are need to start collecting the data. Next one is we've begun collecting the data needed for each activity. We've calculated our carbon emissions once already, and then we've calculated our emissions and have a carbon reduction plan. That's really great for those that are at that last step. We've calculated our emissions and have a carbon reduction plan. But yeah, I'll just leave it a couple of seconds there for people to reply. Okay, I think that's kind of leveled off now. Okay, that's really good. So yeah, as I say, I'll be going through just kind of the process, and each one of these kind of mirrors this. So that's good to see that actually it's quite spread again. So that's good. Thank you very much for doing that. I'm going to go back to my presentation here. Great. So yes, for those of you who answered that you're new to measuring your carbon footprint, this diagram really outlines that process that you're going to want to follow. And it's going to be from the beginning, so that top left, and you're going to work your way through. So some of you already mentioned that you have actually identified which activities to be included, which is great. So you're at that step of collecting your data. Whereas for others, you said you've got your carbon reduction plan. So what is it that you do next? And that's going to be that bottom line that's really going to be more relevant to you. So this first part is all about understanding what it is you want to measure. So which parts of your business and which activities, and then it's going to be collecting that data. And then that second part is the reporting and the apportioning and calculating your carbon footprint. And then finally, we have those steps, yeah, which are after you've measured, what do you do? Because it's not great if it just sits there and you know what your carbon footprint is. You can use that as an opportunity to kind of identify those hotspots and create a carbon reduction plan. So if we go on to this first part, just about understanding which parts of your organization you should include, you're going to want to understand and establish what your organizational boundary is. And really, what this is kind of you'll want to sit down, consider how your business operates, what assets you have, and who you are interacting with as a business. Best practice is generally to involve all parts of your organization. So it's going to include your offices, your vehicles, ideally over different regions or countries, if that's applicable. And so you're going to sit down and just establish that. And once you've identified what your organizational boundary is, you're going to then need to determine which business activities you want to measure. So there's a couple of examples here with the images, but again, you're going to want to sit down, think about your organization's processes and what you kind of do as an organization, and then work it out. So generally, all organizations are going to produce direct emissions, and we refer to those as scope one emissions, and it's the direct greenhouse gas emissions that originate from sources that are owned and controlled by your organization. You will then have scope two emissions, which refer to indirect greenhouse gas emissions, where someone else has created energy generally on behalf of you. So it's going to be electricity from the grid. And then outside scopes one and two, you're going to also want to consider your scope three activities. And that's where it becomes a little bit more complicated in being able to identify which business activities are most relevant to you. Scope three, yeah, really can be a real wide range of sources. There's several different business activities that are included in this. But what you're going to want to do, and why I've provided this slide here, is just so you can kind of have a consideration of what's happening downstream to you and upstream. And in that, there's some examples of the scope three carbon emissions that might be included in that. So you've got the downstream stream, which is referring to your clients, and then your suppliers is that upstream. So how are they working with carbon emissions and working with materials, and what impact is that having on carbon emissions? So this whole process, or this whole step in the process right at the beginning, is to sit down, really consider what is going to be relevant to you. As a minimum, though, what we tend to see is that all organizations include gas, electricity, heating oil, petrol, diesel, the water they use, and waste as well. Of course, it's best practice to include as many activities as you can, but that's generally what we would expect to see, and we do see at that kind of level. So what we have within the carbon calculator is the alignment of those different business activities with the greenhouse gas protocol. So when you are collecting data and you come to report it into the carbon calculator, it should follow this, and it should be quite a straightforward, simple way of filling it out because of that alignment to the greenhouse gas protocol. Then before we go any further though, when we're talking about data, one thing I did just want to point out is, yeah, a point on data quality, because what we tend to see again is that a lot of people say, we only have a little bit of data for vehicles and we can't report it because we don't have all the data. And we really, really emphasize at this point, do not let this discourage you. If you don't have all the data, there are several kind of options that you can pursue and implement to make sure that you can submit something. One of the most common and the one that we use the most is this proxy data. So you're in effect taking a couple of months of the year where you might record vehicle data or you might record electricity consumption, and then you extrapolate that to the rest of the year. It is perfectly fine to do that if you are starting out and you don't have access to all the data that you need, as long as you are transparent about it and you write somewhere what assumptions that you've made. So again, using that example, you would just make sure that on your website or in the report, you're honest about extrapolating that. And generally, you will do it temporarily. So you might use proxy data for the 1 year, and then that offers you the opportunity to put in the processes that you need to collect that data on a more granular basis the following year. But yes, it's totally fine to do that. And we don't want it to discourage you from reporting at all, which we tend to find it does. So yeah, good to know. And you can follow this kind of diagram here to know how best to kind of report the data if you don't have that real data for the year at the top there. So getting to where do you start if you collect your data? So if we start with scope one, so that's your direct carbon emissions, we're going to want to record your company transport. And this is going to be for any vehicles that you own and use in the day-to-day operations of your business. Now, when you collect this data, you're going to want to know the total number of vehicles you have, the total distance traveled by each vehicle, and the type of vehicle it is. So generally what we see is the main measurement is going to be in miles, kilometers when we're looking at that distance. Type of vehicle, we're kind of asking, is it petrol? Is it diesel? Is it electric? Because all of that's going to influence how many carbon emissions are associated with how far it's driven. And then you're going to want to consider, yes, the total distance too. It can be tricky to initially collect all of this data. For some organizations, you might have fuel cards. That's a really great place to start, where it's recording all of the distance on the card, and it's going to be recording the price and kind of the fuel. But if you don't have that, it's a good place to start by just putting an Excel spreadsheet together where you kind of list what vehicles are owned, what type, all those details. And then what you can do is at the beginning of the year where you need to record how much distance you is going to be traveled over that year, you start with that January figure, and then you go back at the end of the year, you collect the end figure, you work out the difference, and that should hopefully give you a good indication of how far that vehicle has traveled. Another way of doing it is if you don't know exactly, or people don't tell you the distance and they just tell you, well, I've gone from here to here. It's a bit tedious, but Google Maps is a good way of kind of working out the miles and the kilometers that have been traveled with that. So that's another alternative. But generally, yes, it's going to be slightly tedious at the beginning where you're just putting this Excel spreadsheet together and you're collecting the details for that. If you don't have all the data, again, this is really where proxy months come in, and you'll see me say that a lot over the next couple of slides. For all of these, proxy months are really the best way of doing it. So for example, if you have nothing and you don't know where to start, you can say how far, okay, did you travel, or where did you travel in the month of October, in the month of January, etc. And then you can say, okay, well, if these 3 months across the year, this is what's happening, we can try and work out an average from that. So really good place to start. The business travel, that's slightly different. We include it in this transport tab, but this is actually going to be a scope 3 category. And within this, you're going to want to collect information on employee commute and also business travel as well. With business travel, the simplest way of asking for that information is generally when expenses have to be claimed or filed by each individual employee. You collect data on, okay, if you're submitting an expense for having traveled by the train. What was the distance that you traveled? Where did you come from? Where did you go? Or if it's by petrol, okay, well, how far did you travel again? Where was it from? Where was it to? And then based on that, you can start collecting the data that you need to be able to work out emissions generated from business travel. But employee commute, what we do in our organization is we send out an employee commute survey every year. So within it, we're asking, okay, how often did you travel into the office? So if you have home working, you'll need to be able to differentiate between how many days are kind of spent at home working, how many are in the office. For those that are in the office, it is that vehicle type, distance traveled, how frequently, all of that kind of information recorded in that miles to kilometer as well. And again, you can use the same techniques here if you don't have all that data. So you can ask for an average if you think that people aren't going to be able to remember for the whole year when they come in. How often did you travel in January? How often did you travel in each kind of quarter of the year? And from that, you can calculate it. It is slightly tedious again, kind of collecting that data. But within our organization, it's really good that we have this understanding, I think, now with why we're doing this. So this fits in actually to our larger piece, which is our environmental management system. So when we explain that, this is the need, we actually need that so we can get certified as an organization that has quite a big influence on us and our clients and who they choose. So it's really key that people do get back to us. And another thing with all of this and just kind of collecting the data, if you can get management on your side from the beginning, also really key. So we have our manager, our managing director kind of announce in the meetings, kind of, this is what we need to collect data with. We send the email around and it always helps. It always gets people to complete it. So the next up we have is fossil fuels, which is going to provide space to enter data on the fuel types your organization uses from plant and equipment or machinery. Also to note, you can actually record data on your company vehicles in here. It's just going to be in that liters unit rather than having worked it out by distance. But what we really, really emphasize at this point is do not record it in both places because that's going to be double counting. And we have had instances where we've seen people go in and they're not quite sure and they record a bit in one and a bit in the other and it just makes it a lot more complicated. So if you can, you either record into the transport tab or you record it into the fossil fuels tab here. Um, but yeah, for most of the organizations that we have, it is really going to be your gas usage rather than transportation. And for working out what your gas usage is, there's really several different ways that you can do it. You can check a bill that has been provided to you by your gas company. You can check a gas meter if you have a gas meter, or even a smart meter if you have a smart meter employed. Um, and then if you only own like a section of the building or you're renting a section of the building, you'll probably need to reach out to your landlord. And this applies actually across a lot of what we're come to. So electricity, waste, etc. You're going to need to apportion what you find out to your space in the office or the number of people. But generally, how we do it, it is that space element. So if you know that, excuse me, um, your gas is a certain number, you will put, and your kind of square footage in the office is 20% of the total square footage of that building. You'll then apply that to the gas usage, and you can do that. And that's kind of the best way that we would recommend if you are renting a building and you want to find out. Again, if you don't know all the data for the whole year, proxy months are great, but that is one where you should hopefully be able to reach out to the gas company or your landlord, and they will be able to provide it on that monthly basis. We're come to fugitive emissions now. So, fugitive emissions, that is the release of gases or vapors from leakages of equipment. So, typically, it's going to be pressure containing equipment and from components like valves, piping flanges, pumps, fridges, storage tanks. So for some organizations, this is going to be very relevant. For others, it's not going to be relevant at all. But for this one, generally what we or you can find that data on fugitive emissions from internal records and documentation. So there should be some kind of report or some kind of log that's kept for when these inspections are carried out that are going to tell you how much the machinery item has been topped up and whatever the loss is, there is going to be what's kind of leaked out. If you're missing data on fugitive emissions in your company, you can look back at historical maintenance reports or repair records, and that should give you a good indication of past leaks or fugitive emissions. But yeah, in this case, it's there should be someone within your organization who deals with that technical side a little bit more, or at least knows where the books are for people who might come in and do those checks for you. With electricity, this is hopefully one of the most straightforward ones when we're trying to collect the data. So it is, yep, all the emissions that are produced from the electricity that you use directly as an organization. So we collect it in kilowatt hours. You're going to be able to find that information generally on your electricity bill. Again, it's similar to gas, so it's going to be, yeah, electricity bill, electricity meter. You might have a smart meter, and then again, if you're renting or you're only in a part of the building, you're going to want to reach out to your landlord. And it's really good actually starting to ask these questions to your landlord, not only kind of what is the usage that we're using, but what's being done to kind of improve energy efficiency if they aren't doing anything around that, or to basically just help reduce carbon emissions. So yes, if you're missing information on electricity and your consumption, you should be able to reach out directly to the electricity company and they should be able to provide it for you. But worst case scenario, you can use that proxy data. But just bear in mind that it is going to fluctuate with gas as well on the season in during the year. So that November or October to, well, I mean, the summer hasn't really started yet, so probably a lot longer, but just bear that in mind where you're allocating the emissions because, yeah, there's going to be higher consumption in some months due to the weather and climate than others. For materials, this is one of the more complicated ones when we're looking at collecting the data that we need to work out carbon emissions, just because it requires you to work out what materials it is that you're using and where they're coming from. For some organizations, if you're just kind of dealing with the day-to-day use of office supplies and things like that, which we refer to as kind of material usage, it's not going to be as complicated, perhaps. You're just going to want to know what they are and yeah, where they've come from. But if you're using materials for products or in manufacturing, you're going to find it maybe a little bit more complicated to know where to start because you'll have an abundance of different materials from different places that are being used. Again, it is really key that you just keep in mind where they're coming from. So are they virgin materials or are they recycled materials? Because that's going to have a big difference on how much carbon is produced from them. And then for material usage, it's also kind of where they're coming from as well. Um, so yes, for this, it can be really time consuming to collect the data for each material. So where we'd recommend you kind of start if you are new to it is you get that spreadsheet and you kind of think, okay, what are the top 5 materials that we use in the organization if we're manufacturing a product? And you can do that by like sales revenue, how much you spend, or it could be the composition of the product at the end. But by doing that, you can then prioritize, okay, well, knowing that we're going to look at these top 5 and we'll start with these top 5. And once we've got the data and we're confident with the data for these top 5, we can expand it out to the other materials that we might use in the process. Yes, but it can be difficult. So that's probably the best way to start. Then we have waste, and waste is a little bit similar to materials in that what we want to know is what type of waste has been produced, the amount, and how it has been disposed of. So in a similar way to materials, there's a difference between, if it's a virgin material or it's recycled, it's the same with waste. If you're sending something to landfill, the carbon emissions associated are going to be a lot higher than if you're recycling that material. If you're using plastic waste and you're sending that to be recycled. So you want to know those 3 elements. And again, where you can find that is, or that data should be on invoices for some things. It will also be on waste transfer notes, which is a really key thing to kind of look at and consider. And in the carbon calculator, we measure it in tons. So that's something just to be careful of, because if you're just a small organization, you're probably going to be measuring it in kilograms. So just bear that in mind when you're entering it. It might just require you to kind of do that conversion before you put it in. But yeah, in terms of the types of waste that go in, we have categorizations that are provided on the carbon calculator that can really help you know what to look at. But generally, it's going to be split into residual domestic. You've got plastic there, you've got paper, electrical, and then you've got construction waste as well. If you are in a rented building, then again, it's going to probably require a conversation with your landlord who should be measuring the waste. If they're not, this is a great, prompt for them to do so. But looking at, yeah, getting them to measure what type of waste is produced, where it's going, yeah, how it's being disposed of. And then from that data, you can then work it out based on your area within the office again, with how much that you are producing. In terms of if you're missing data, again, proxy months are really, really great here. So if you don't have anything and you're just starting to it, and your landlord probably doesn't have all the time to be able to figure this out at the beginning, you can ask for several months, and hopefully they'll be able to provide the data for that as well. There is also a space for water and carbon emissions that are associated with the consumption and then the treatment of the water. So when we talk about consumption, that's kind of when you turn the tap on and you're using the water. You might use it in products, or you might use it just to drink in the office. But there's also that treated element as well, which is kind of the disposal of the water. So what you should get when you get the water bill is it should come in liters, and it should divide that and split consumption and treatment out already, so you know. And then when you're entering it into the carbon calculator, it should be quite straightforward. But yeah, just bear that in mind. If you don't have that data, reach out to the water company. Again, if you're renting, reach out to your landlord. And then if you're missing data, it is going to be the proxy months that you can do again. Inside the carbon calculator, we also have three other tabs. That's the other emissions tab, a policies tab, and company info. Really key here to point out for that other emissions tab is any other business activities that might not have been included in the previous kind of tabs that we have. So in particular, with that, we're referring to home working. If you have carbon emissions from home working, we are mostly based at home, so there's actually quite a considerable impact from home working, especially from the gas element and keeping homes warm. But it might also be from goods and services consumed upstream. So there's scope to include it in this tab, and it's highly recommended that you do if you know it, just so then you've got a more complete picture of your carbon emissions. So when you're trying to identify those hotspots and reduce carbon emissions, you can do so. We also have the policies and company info tab, which are just, again, it's really a great place to keep all the information that's going to be relevant. So you have different policy strategies for those that mentioned that they have carbon reduction strategies already. You can upload them into the carbon calculator. And there's also, yeah, if you put in figures with turnover, there's some calculations that it can do so it can work out what your carbon emissions are per employee. So again, really, really useful to include that information in there. So that's quite a lot, but that's when you're looking at collecting the data, hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of where you can start. And if you don't know where to collect it from, some advice and hints with the proxy months and kind of, yeah, who to reach out to, where to get it from and all of that. Say you've now got all that data and you're ready to enter it into the carbon calculator. What you'll also need to do is this apportionment step, which is referring to kind of allocating a percentage of the carbon emissions that your organization is going to have produced to a specific organization based on a certain criterion. And within the carbon calculator, we use a percentage of sales revenue as that criterion. So, for example, once you've got your carbon emission figure, it's going to say, okay, well, if we've spent £20,000 with organization X, and we know that £100,000 is our total sales revenue, we know that 20% of our carbon emissions can be apportioned to that organization. When you are completing this section, though, what you may find is that not all of the organizations that you work with are there, and you can't allocate that percentage. So in that case, we say just leave it blank, because there is a chance that in the future they'll be joining. Once you've submitted all your data, it's very, very difficult for us or for you to kind of change that. So it's better to leave it blank. And then what you can do is go back and then just reallocate, or not reallocate, but allocate it to it when they have been added. If you don't have any organizations in there or don't recognize any clients, you can also just put in 10% to the non-partner client. And the reason for needing to do that is you do need to apportion to at least one organization before you can submit all of the data to work out and calculate your carbon emissions. So apportionment step done. You'll then come to the carbon calculator calculating what your carbon footprint is. Behind the scenes, what it's doing is it's taking the data that you've entered for each business activity, and it's then multiplying that by an emission factor or a conversion factor, which will then give it an associated carbon emission. In the carbon calculator, we use the DEFRA conversion factors, which are provided by the UK government. They're updated each year. So each year we go in and we update the carbon figures so it's accurate. And from that, yeah, it will give you this carbon footprint figure. Two things to just point out is, yeah, just when you're entering, or the results that it gives you are in tons of CO2 equivalent. So just be careful, because if you're a smaller organization, again, you might be working in this kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And then, yes, it's the difference of 1,000 when you're having to calculate from tons to the kilograms. But once you've done this, it will give you your carbon footprint. And then what next? And this is, yeah, again, where it's really, really key to do something with what you've actually calculated and use what you've gained, or the carbon footprint, the information around your carbon footprint, to identify hotspots within your organization for wanting to reduce carbon emissions. So the carbon hotspots are areas of your organization that are going to be generating the highest carbon emissions, which can be identified from your carbon footprint. And once you have identified them, what we'd suggest is you kind of go about developing targets to reduce carbon emissions, and then you come up with a carbon reduction plan around each of those. So with scope one and scope two, we'd expect to see that quite high. For scope one, there's loads of different actions that you can do. What I've done is I've included a slide, I think the next slide or the one after, which just outlines some really simple actions that you can take if you're starting from scratch or just consider to reduce your carbon emissions. But it is a lot to do with energy efficiency measures and vehicle efficiency measures, switching to electric, that kind of thing. Um, so yeah, good to just bear that in mind when you are um, looking at how to reduce your carbon emissions. At this point, it's also really important to continually consider how you can improve the monitoring and evaluation of both the targets that you set, but also your carbon emissions and collecting that data. So at the beginning, I kind of mentioned that you can use proxy months, it's absolutely fine, but have a long-term plan. So you're not relying on that each year. Yeah, fine to start with it, but just come up with some kind of process that you'll be able to implement the following year that will allow you to collect that data on a more granular level. Also, just a note here is, yeah, about setting baseline. So once you have worked out your carbon emissions or your carbon footprint for the first year, you can then use that as your baseline, which is basically going to become that benchmark for when you're reducing your carbon emissions. So it's a really great reference point. What I would say with the baseline is that it should, at a minimum, really be a year, which you look at. It's most commonly a year. It shouldn't be any less than that. It definitely shouldn't be a couple of months because so much can happen within those couple of months. So it is generally once you have submitted your data to the carbon calculator for the first time for that year, you can then use that as your baseline and you can measure your targets up against that. Um, You've also got the carbon reduction plan and developing that. Just quickly on developing a carbon reduction plan, I won't go into too much detail, but if you go onto gov.uk, they do actually provide a template that you can use that kind of covers a lot of what you would need in a quite robust carbon reduction plan. So it's going to be asking for commitments to net zero, what your baseline emissions footprint is, current emission reporting, and then yeah, what carbon reduction projects you've got implemented or plan on implementing as well. And then here, just in terms of some actions that you can adopt, there are numerous. Here are, yeah, some of those most basic ones. I'm not going to go through them, but in the slides that get sent out, feel free to just kind of come back and refer to that. And also this slide here, which is really key to point out, and it's the carbon and energy hierarchy. So when you're looking at your carbon reduction plan, think of it from this perspective. So start from the top and think, okay, well, how can we actually avoid, in this case, using energy at all? So if you're used to having office lights on overnight, well, do we actually need them on? Let's just turn them off. That's a great place to start. That's going to reduce our energy then. If you can't turn them off, but you do still want to reduce your carbon emissions from them, let's look at what else we can do. Can we swap those halogen bulbs to LED bulbs? And then it's going to reduce the amount of energy that's consumed. And then look at that next one, which is switch. Okay, well then can we also look at buying renewable energy instead, or can we put some solar panels on and use energy from that? And then that last one, the compensate, how can you remove the residual emissions if you can't do anything else? Now, that last piece is relating to this carbon offsetting piece, which is really, really key at the minute. A lot of organizations are relying on this. Um, and yeah, it's great. I would just, I always put on this slide caution, choose carefully and as a last resort, because really, if we look back at that hierarchy quickly, this is the order that it should be followed. So as an organization, don't rely on carbon offsetting. Um, it should be, yeah, last resort, and it's not actually addressing the root cause of the problem. And what we're seeing a lot is now organizations getting called out for just relying on offsetting, really, rather than actually making any efforts to reduce their carbon emissions anywhere else. The other thing I would just mention with carbon offsetting is you do have to be really careful about the scheme that you go for, because there's a lot of projects out there that aren't maybe accredited, they don't have that robustness to them. And again, organizations are getting called out, and not intentional in this case, because they think that they're investing into a project that's actually doing a lot of good. But you look behind it, you look at what's actually going on, and it's, oh, they're planting trees, but they're planting invasive species in a really sensitive area of biodiversity where it's drinking all the water, and now the local community don't have any. So it's really, really key to consider what the implications are of the project that you're going to invest in, and take a lot of care just to kind of consider what it is. If you don't have time, like a lot of organizations, I've included the gold standard here. That is one that we kind of recommend. We don't endorse it or anything like that, but it's got a little bit more robustness in terms of the criteria behind it. And also, a lot of the projects aren't just looking at one potential element, which is that drawdown of carbon. It's also considering having positive benefits on biodiversity and also on the local community as well, providing them with some kind of income too. So yes, ultimately, don't rely on carbon offsetting, but yeah, it's understood that it has to be done a lot of the time. Just be careful when you do it, because there's a lot of organizations that are getting tripped up when they are looking at this. So I have just very quickly gone through all the steps there that you would need to follow to measure your carbon footprint for the first time. And hopefully you've also found it useful if you are familiar with carbon reduction plans and kind of a review of the process, because it is changing and it will change all the time. After that review stage, reconsider what parts of your organization should be included, which activities to be included. Every year we're finding more Scope 3 activities that are coming up that should be reported on. So go through that process of just considering it, and feed that then back into how you collect your data, how you're reporting your data, how you're then creating your carbon reduction plan, and just continuously go around this cycle when you can, just to make sure. And I mean, identify parts of your organization. Generally, organizations are growing all the time. If you've got new offices coming, are you including them? If you're kind of expanding overseas, how is that being included into it? So yeah, just things to consider when you are measuring your carbon footprint. Again, I just, for the last part, want to highlight some of the resources that I've mentioned during the webinar today. So the first is the carbon calculator tool. So I've included the link there, which you'll be able to just click on. And then there's also the carbon calculator, a beginner's guide to measuring carbon emissions, which is really what the basis of this webinar comes from. So it explores what I've gone through today in a lot more detail, but still hopefully in a way that's quite digestible, not too overwhelming, because there is so much jargon when we speak about carbon. And this kind of guide, yeah, it goes through some of that, what it all means and where to start. Another kind of set of resources here. I won't go through all of these, but yes, there's different kind of tools or different papers that are going to be linked to you depending on your industry. So yeah, that will be sent out in the deck. What I'm going to do is get rid of that, and then I will see if there's any questions. So nothing in the chat. Oh, wait, yes. Okay. Why is water vapor a problem? Water vapor is not a artificial greenhouse gas, or not artificial, that's the wrong term, but it is one of the most abundant. And what we're seeing is that as the temperature of the atmosphere is increasing, we're getting more and more water vapor that's being sent into the atmosphere. And that leads to storms, so higher intensity storms, higher frequency of storms. And then that is obviously having an impact on coastal communities, everyone really flooding. So in itself, there's not too much that we can do for water vapor, but it is included in there. Collecting the data is the difficult area for me for Scope 3, commuting and materials. Yeah, absolutely agree with that. So as I was saying with commuting, I would do that commuter employee survey. It can be difficult to get everyone on board with collecting that, and I guess try and find the way that would be the best way to ask for that information. So for us, it is an Excel spreadsheet. For others, it could be a Google form. For others, it might be that you actually have to get everyone in the room at like a team meeting and say, right, you can't leave until you've finished, this little survey. But yeah, that's the best place to start with commuting. And then materials, again, invoices, best place to look at for kind of materials that have been bought in. And then, yeah, prioritize, look at those top 5 or those top 3 to begin with, and then expand out each year once you're confident that you have got that data. Does that mean you can say that? Sorry, so if your energy supplier generates 30% from wind farms, does that mean you can say that 30% of the electricity we use is carbon zero? You have to be very careful around this because no, there are carbon emissions still associated with renewables, and that is primarily from the transportation of that energy or electricity from one place to the other. So the grid is not completely decarbonized. So there are carbon emissions, yeah, associated with that. So I wouldn't recommend saying that. Is there a list of accredited schemes and who is the accreditation body? I think I'll just need a little bit more context on that one. If someone can send that through. Where can I find access to the carbon calculator? As I cannot click on the link. So I'll send the slides out. So that should be in there. Is the template you mentioned in the links slide, is it the Cabinet Office one? Thanks. I'll double check that. I think it is, yes. And any good resources on reducing staff air travel? Oh, this is a really tricky one. Um, oh, I mean, we have a policy where it really highlights online meetings. There has to be a really good justification to meet in person. If you can't do it online, that is in effect the only other way that they justify allowing you to travel for air. But it's also difficult if you've got different parts of your organization based overseas, there's going to be an element of air travel. Um, so I would say yes, having a strict policy on when it's appropriate and just, yeah, being a bit stricter about that. And then also, of course, like removing domestic flights within the UK if you can. Northern Ireland, a little bit tricky with that part, but yes, I would say those are two places to start. And then I can have a look for you for other resources in the school to see if we can find anything else. Is there a cost to use the carbon calculator? No, it's completely free. So if you just head to that link, which will be in the slides, you'll be able to go in, set yourself up, and you can start measuring your carbon footprint. And then carbon offsetting schemes, I've just got that as a kind of statement rather than a question. But with that, yeah, I would recommend the gold standard, who have a lot of different projects in areas around the world. Not really too many in the UK, unfortunately, but there are other carbon offsetting schemes that offer that. I think is it it's not the National Trust, but there's a forestry body in the UK that does carbon offsetting as well. There are loads of really good ones in the UK as well. You don't always need to go further afield, but it's just for us, we tend to use the gold standard because we have that assurance piece there. And with that, what I can also do is actually, when we're looking for carbon offsetting, we follow the Oxford University principal guidelines for carbon offsetting, which is basically just a set of criteria that you can have a look at when you're trying to decide which carbon offsetting scheme you should be going for. So, I think that is pretty much all the questions, and we're just in time. Oh, can you send us lists of some companies who do carbon offsetting in Europe? I can do. I think what you'll find is that the majority of big companies now are offsetting in some kind of way. But yes, I will send some really interesting carbon offsetting schemes that some are doing. So yes, that's absolutely fine. And how do we receive the slides? Will it be via email? Yes, it will be, but never got the slides. No, you should be getting them by the by email. So I've made a note of your name there, and I will make sure that you get them. But yeah, so if there's anyone else who thinks they have a similar problem in that they haven't received the slides from the after, let me know and I can send them directly. But thank you so much. I haven't posted the feedback form, so that would be that would be a good place to go. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. I don't think where is the feedback form? I will put the feedback form in the link to the which comes with the slides. But yeah, it's always really useful to hear what you think about the content. If there's something you would have preferred that I spend a little bit more time on, or you felt that you had a good enough knowledge of something and you'd prefer, yeah, more time spent on this, let me know. It's always really useful. But thank you so much for joining and enjoy the rest of your afternoons. Thank you very much.